If it's Monday, President-elect Donald Trump taps a staunch supporter of the family separation policy from his first term to be the border czar in his second term as Trump's new priorities begin to take shape. Plus, the Kremlin denying Washington Post reporting that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump recently spoke by phone about the war in Ukraine as the world prepares for an unpredictable era of Trump foreign policy. And who will be the next Senate Majority Leader? One candidate vowing to push the Trump agenda as top Republicans jockey to take the reins from Mitch McConnell, all while control of the House remains uncertain with more than a dozen races still uncalled. And welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Aaron Gilchrist in Washington as President-elect Donald Trump's second administration begins to take shape, and with President Biden now planning to host Mr. Trump at the White House this week. Late last night, the president-elect announcing Tom Homan, his former acting director of ICE, as his new border czar. Homan was an early proponent of the first Trump administration's controversial family separation policy. Now, Homan has said the new mass deportation plan would be, quote, well-targeted. Here he is this morning on Fox News.
President Trump is going to secure this border. He's going to save American lives. He's going to, by securing the border, we're going to drop illegal alien crime, which is skyrocketing. Yep. Well, less people are going to die from fentanyl. Less children are going to be sex trafficked. Less women will be sex assaulted on the southern border. The criminal cartels will be put out of business by this president.
Now, in addition to installing Homan, Trump is also expected to bring another loyalist and immigration hardliner into his inner circle, Stephen Miller. That's as his deputy chief of staff for policy. That's according to a source with knowledge of the Trump transition team's plans. Now, both Homan and Miller will likely be central players in potential roundups of illegal immigrants, a plan that Trump made a cornerstone of his campaign.
On day one, I will launch the largest deportation program in American history. I will rescue every city and town that has been invaded and conquered.
Now, the president-elect also announcing a top congressional ally, New York's Elise Stefanik, as his pick to be the next UN ambassador. And within the last hour or so, he's also announced he's choosing former New York Congressman Lee Zeldin to lead the EPA. Now, we expect to learn more about who else will fill key roles in the coming days, including critical national security and defense roles. Two sources telling NBC News that a controversial Trump loyalist, Kash Patel, is under consideration to take over the CIA or the FBI. When Trump tried to install Patel in the CIA during his first term, the head of the agency at the time threatened to resign in protest. Now, all of this comes as NBC News now projects Mr. Trump will sweep all 7 battleground states. That's after NBC News called Arizona in his favor over the weekend. That final call giving Trump 312 electoral votes in his decisive presidential race victory. I'm joined now by Garrett Hake, who covered the Trump campaign and is now covering the Trump transition. Also with me, NBC News Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley and our Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Delanian as well. Garrett, I'll start with you here. Every appointment so far, other than Elise Stefanik, is someone who served in the first Trump administration. What do you make of that at this point? He's surrounding himself with familiar faces, familiar voices, familiar views?
Well, Lee Zeldin was a big ally on the Hill during that time, and I think that's right. I mean, Donald Trump is something of a creature of habit. He's something of a creature of comfort. A lot of these folks campaigned with him. To sort of slant quote from Nancy Pelosi, oftentimes there are guys who need jobs and jobs who need guys. It seems like he's dealing with the guys who need jobs first, finding spots for people with whom he is comfortable and who he wants to have in his ear all the time as president again.
So what are you hearing? What can you report? Who else needs a job that Donald Trump might be looking at?
Well, switching to the jobs who need guys part of it, I think the key thing to look at is how many more members of Congress can he afford to take? The House is going to have a very narrow majority. So, too, is the Senate. That could leave a lot of these Trump loyalists who've been with him for a long time on the outside looking in. Earlier today, we saw Eric Schmidt, the Missouri senator, former AG of Missouri, take his name out of the running for a cabinet position. I wouldn't be surprised if there are more of those that follow, in part because my sources in the Trump transition have indicated that he doesn't necessarily want to stack the cabinet with lawmakers. He's going to be looking outside. So we might be hearing some new names, folks who are not necessarily from the political set, to fill out some of these bigger jobs perhaps in the next few days.
Julia, I think potentially a new name for people outside Washington might be Tom Homan, who is someone who worked in the first administration, but for folks who don't know him, who is he?
Yeah, he was the acting ICE director under the first Trump administration. In fact, he was there during family separations, and he's defended that policy. He said that, of course, they expected that separating parents from their children would deter migration, and he's defended it. He will now be in charge of this mass deportation force. We should point out that as acting ICE director, he was never Senate confirmed, and now he will not be put up before the Senate. So the kind of scrutiny you might get with cabinet-level positions, he won't be in that spotlight. Also, bringing him in closer to the White House will allow him to have direct access to Trump and to Stephen Miller, and to continue to push these policies that are very close to the president for deportations. And he won't have to deal with things like CISA or FEMA, other things the DHS secretary will have. He won't have to answer to as many people, go through regulatory processes, and he could do things like work with the State Department to try to expedite deportations in a way that he would be more stymied if he were the head of a different department.
And he's going to report directly to Trump, we've been told.
Yes, okay.
And I do want to ask you about the how of it all. I mean, has he given any insight on what mass deportation might look like, how he might execute that?
He has. I mean, he's basically said, as you had at the top of the show, that this is going to be about criminals. It's also going to be about the people who have recently arrived. But when we talk to people who are close to Homeland, close to Trump, they say, look, no one is exempt. That means families. That means taking away a lot of the protections that the Biden administration put around vulnerable populations. There were certain areas where you couldn't arrest people, like courthouses and places of worship. A lot of that might go out the window. We've also learned that the legal pathways that the Biden administration set up through parole programs for people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, as well as the CBP One app that allows them to make asylum appointments in northern Mexico, that's all gone. And the people who came in legally, believing they had a legal pathway into this country, could now be eligible for deportation in a Trump administration. It's a way they're going to try to boost those numbers because, as we've heard from soon-to-be Deputy White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, they think that they could deport 1 million a year. Of course, the logistics, the funding still has yet to be determined.
Garrett, I want to turn to Elise Stefanik, now chosen, will be the nominee for United Nations ambassador. Obviously an ardent supporter of former President-elect Trump now. How does she figure into that as the UN ambassador? She doesn't have a diplomatic background.
No. In fact, also not a big fan of the UN is Elise Stefanik. I mean, look, I think this is a little bit of Trump kind of giving the finger to the foreign policy establishment to a certain extent. Maybe that's a bit too strong, but this is him saying we're going to have my style here as we deal with the rest of the world. Trump's never been a fan of the UN. He's not a fan of any multilateral foreign institutions. He likes the U.S. to deal directly with its allies and with its adversaries. Stefanik, for example, is a very big supporter of Israel, who's also butts heads with the UN from time to time. And so I think this is very much a message to the UN that sort of the kinder, gentler world of world diplomacy is on the outs when Trump comes back to Washington.
So one of the other names that sort of pops up every few hours, it seems like, is Elon Musk.
Yeah.
Right? He keeps coming back. How does he figure into the transition at this point and potentially into the new administration?
It's a great question and one that we're constantly endeavoring to answer because Elon Musk, as best that I can tell, has hardly left Mar-a-Lago since Election Day. He has been spotted there repeatedly. He is Trump's ear. He's been described as an informal advisor and a friend to Trump. Obviously, he has a wide variety of his own interests, which are sometimes in line with Trump's, but not always. I mean, Elon Musk is also one of the biggest proponents of solar power on the planet, if not just in this country. That's not necessarily something where he's in line with Donald Trump. So the best I can tell, he's offering some advice. He's, involving himself in some of these decisions. But I've been told he has no specific formal role yet, and he may not. I mean, you want to talk about somebody with conflicts of interest. This is someone who became a billionaire in large part because of the government contracts of SpaceX and the subsidies that Tesla gets. So he's in a very complex position here, but certainly close to Trump. And I'll just add, Trump puts sort of a premium on fellow billionaires. Yeah. He sees them as peers. He's going to listen to their advice, often above and beyond that of even his own paid staff. And I think that applies with Musk as well.
To that end, do you have a sense of sort of who else is hanging around Mar-a-Lago? What other people are either interested in positions or interested in having some degree of influence?
Well, look, it's always a similar cast of characters. I mean, the Mar-a-Lago membership and the people who've been longtime Trump friends still tend to be down there. I'm interested to hear what somebody like Ike Perlmutter has been doing. He's the former chairman of Marvel. He's a longtime Trump friend, another of these billionaire guys who's there. I mean, it's also how people like Howard Lutnick got into the circle, or Steve Witkoff, for that matter, who's now going to be part of the team leading the inauguration. I think if I had one group of people on this planet I wish I were better sourced with, it's Mar-a-Lago members, because they're going to know a lot about what's going on in the Trump transition and White House long before the rest of us do over the next month.
Julia, you also reported that Trump may be trying to deport thousands of migrants that President Biden allowed into the country legally. Walk us through some of your reporting that who are these migrants?
Yeah, so these are the ones who came in from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. This was a program that Biden set up to decrease the number of migrants coming across the border illegally. And 30,000 per month, basically for the last 2 years, have been allowed to come in from those 4 countries collectively. The reason they sought out those countries in the first place, Aaron, is because they're very hard to deport to. They don't historically take back their nationals from the United States because of our diplomatic relationships with them. So this is a way to try to legalize those people, allow them to work. If this is taken away from them, they then could be in a place where they're deported. Again, the Trump administration is going to have to figure out where to deport them. Are they going to try to put pressure on these countries through diplomatic channels or through tariffs? I mean, it's really hard to figure out exactly where they would send them. They could also look at third-party countries, like sending people who aren't from Mexico or Guatemala, for example, back to those countries. It also includes people who got asylum appointments. If they're not on the path for asylum yet, they could be looking at deportation.
Garrett, I'll end with you here. We have this Oval Office meeting coming on Wednesday between the president-elect and the sitting president. Obviously, no love between these two men through the course of the campaign, and they've not said nice things about each other. What do you anticipate we might see with Donald Trump visiting Joe Biden?
If past his prologue, I actually think the tone will be respectful. Whether that's sincere or not, it's not for me to say. But when then incoming President Donald Trump, President-elect Trump, met with Barack Obama, he described the meeting very warmly afterwards, talked about the idea that they were supposed to meet for 20 minutes. They met for 90. Even afterwards, Trump referred to some of the sort of lessons that Barack Obama had told him about what to expect from the world when he took over as president. I am optimistic we will see a similar version of Trump, at least while he is in the confines of the Oval Office and at the White House on Wednesday.
Yeah, we'll be watching the body language, too, to see
right.
what that tells us. Garrett and Julia, thank you both. I want to turn to Ken Delanian now, talk a little bit more about Kash Patel. Ken, help us understand who he is and how he fits into this.
Aaron, Kash Patel is probably the purest expression of MAGA conspiracy theories about the national security and law enforcement state in human form that there is. So he sort of came to the fore as a staffer for the House Intelligence Committee on the Republican side when they were fighting the Mueller investigation. And then he was hired in a Department of Defense role in the first Trump administration. And Donald Trump actually tried to make him deputy CIA director, but Gina Haspel, the CIA director at the time, threatened to resign if that happened. And so Trump didn't go through with it. But now he has sort of been waging war against what he calls the deep state. He wrote a memoir called Government Gangsters. And he is arguing, as are many in Trump world, that there are criminal elements inside the FBI and the national security state, the CIA, that are waging war on Donald Trump and his allies, that are doing illegal things. They must be investigated. They must be rooted out. So the idea of him atop of either the FBI or the CIA is very frightening to a lot of the career employees who are inside and just promises to be incredibly, incredibly disruptive, Aaron.
So, Ken, I'd like to know, what are you looking at when it comes to some of the key posts that are being filled in the administration at this point?
Well, just that, in terms of the world that I cover, the Department of Justice and the FBI, and then to a lesser extent, the intelligence community, there's a big gap between someone like Kash Patel and a more traditional Republican like, say, Mike Rogers, who ran unsuccessfully for the Senate in Michigan, who's a Donald Trump supporter. He's a former FBI agent. He was chairman of the Republican, of the House Intelligence Committee under the Republicans in a more normal era. So he's MAGA, he's a Trump guy, but he would be greeted, I think, inside the FBI as a sort of a normal FBI director. Kash Patel, that's another story. Same thing over at the Justice Department. There are people now who are under consideration for Attorney General. There's a man named Mark Paoletta who's been advocating that Donald Trump can order the DOJ to investigate particular people. That would violate 5 decades of post-Watergate norms. That would be one thing. And then there are other people like, for example, Matt Whitaker, who was acting Attorney General before, who would be seen as less disruptive, less threatening. So we're going to learn a lot about the direction of the second Trump presidency by looking at the people that he appoints to these very crucial roles. And his aides have said that for example, who he appoints as Attorney General is his most important priority.
So, Ken, before I let you go, very quickly, there's been this reporting from NBC News that the Justice Department is going to focus on some January 6th cases between now and Inauguration Day. Very quickly, what do we know about those efforts at the DOJ?
Yeah, what the reporting is, Aaron, is that they will stop investigating people who simply illegally entered the Capitol and only focus on the worst cases, the people who committed violence against police officers, because there are hundreds of those people who are on video who still haven't been prosecuted. And there's a real fear that as soon as Donald Trump takes office, that whole investigation is going to go away. He's already promised to pardon some of the people who have been convicted. So there's a lot of concern inside the DOJ that there are very many people who are going to get away with having assaulted law enforcement officers simply because the clock ran out. Donald Trump came in and stopped the investigation. Now, whether he actually pardons people who've been convicted of assaulting officers and who are on video doing that, that's another thing. It's one thing to promise it, it's another thing to do it. But whatever happens, it's pretty much the consensus is that the steam will be taken out of what's left of the January 6th criminal investigations, Aaron.
All right, we'll leave it there, Ken Delaney, and thank you. Coming up, we will dive deeper into what the president-elect's mass deportation plan could look like with a former White House official who oversaw the border in Trump's first term. Plus, Arab leaders at an emergency summit in Saudi Arabia after ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas come to a halt. You're watching Meet the Press now. And welcome back. As we mentioned, some of President-elect Trump's first announcements for key roles in his new administration showcase the emphasis he likely plans to put on issues tied to the border and undocumented immigrants. Former acting ICE Director Tom Homan has been tapped to serve as border czar. He backed Mr. Trump's zero-tolerance border policy in his first term and has promised to, quote, run the biggest deportation force this country has ever seen. The president-elect is also expected to hire Stephen Miller to serve as Deputy White House Chief of Staff for Policy. Miller is a longtime advocate of hard-right policies on immigration. And joining me now is Ken Cuccinelli. He was a senior official in the Department of Homeland Security during the first Trump administration and is currently a senior fellow at the Center for Renewing America. Mr. Cuccinelli, thank you for making some time for us today.
Good to be with you.
You said in an interview this week that Trump, quote, held back on enforcement during his first administration because he didn't want to look mean, especially when it came to removing undocumented immigrants from interior parts of the country. Help us understand that. What do you expect a Trump administration that is not holding back to look like next year?
So I expect the president, who has set the highest bar of all for himself in terms of deportations, to work vigorously to meet that bar and to exceed it. And by that, I mean to deport more illegal aliens than any president ever has before. And he's determined to do that, and in ways that he was not in his first term. And frankly, announcing Tom Homan as border czar is making that very clear. But Donald Trump, one of his traits is that the things that he has committed to in terms of policy and campaigns, including in 2016, he tries very hard to follow through on. And that has not always been true, at least on the Republican side of the aisle during my adult lifetime. So I fully expect to see this pursued to the utmost and using every legal tool available.
A lot of people are trying to figure out what this looks like in practice, right? Are we going to be looking at ICE and other law enforcement agents looking to find undocumented immigrants in schools and in workplaces all around the country?
You will find them in workplaces for sure. You start out with almost 500,000 criminal illegal aliens on top of the 1.3 or 1.4 million removal orders that are already in place today. That's almost 2 million people right there before you have even expanded beyond those basic priority areas. So I fully expect the president is going to try to make a run at removing all of the folks that came in during the Biden administration, plus all of the criminals and long-term folks who've stayed beyond that time period as well. And, you know, we'll see. Time will tell how far down that list he's able to get in 4 years. But I fully expect a vigorous effort.
I guess I'm wondering if we're going to see, you know, will you have federal agents raiding, storming their way into restaurants and department stores and potentially school buildings looking for some of these undocumented immigrants that they think may be in some of these places?
Well, I know you all in the media would love those pictures painted out, but I think it's going to be a lot more methodical and efficient than that. You will remember in the summer of 2019, The largest workplace enforcement action was in Mississippi. It was in chicken plants. Over 600 people arrested in one day, detained for deportation because they were being exploited by that business. The folks who worked at that business were prosecuted because of their role in exploiting the illegal aliens there as well. And the next week, there was a job fair, and black and white, poor folks from Mississippi were ecstatic to be able to get into those jobs and start making money for their own families. So just like Eisenhower was motivated by raising the wages of American citizen poor people, you're going to see that happen under these policies with Donald Trump as well.
I guess I'm just lost on the how of it all, you know, and I understand the policy aspect of it and trying to execute on what the law already offers, but people are grappling with trying to understand how this plays out, how it's executed. If we don't see these things happening in these restaurants and such, does that mean it all happens under the cover of night, for example? Like, what exactly should the American people expect to see the new Trump administration doing?
Well, instead of, for example, having the Boston Police Department repeatedly release sex offenders with cooperation from Congress tying appropriations to the money going to Massachusetts, you can force them to either give up that money or cooperate. And so you'll see criminal aliens by the hundreds of thousands handed over to ICE smoothly, efficiently, and deported quickly, just as should be happening today, which will lower crime and increase safety, including in blue states and cities. That's one. And then there will simply be the finding and removing of those with removal orders. And like I said, those two categories alone take us to almost 2 million people. Other folks in those households, if they're addressed in their household, who are here illegally, will not be passed up as was done in the Biden administration. They will also be included. That's a simple matter of efficiency. This is a major logistical undertaking in addition to being a very significant policy goal. And the logistics of it will be among the more complex domestic operations that have ever taken place in the United States. So having someone like Tom Homan, who was an operator, who ran ICE and was an ICE agent, who knows all of the ins and outs of how to execute on a plan like this, is a big difference from just kind of visionary and policy folks such as Stephen Miller, and not that you don't need those, but to have an operator alongside there in the White House suggests to me that they're planning on getting after the nuts and bolts that are necessary to build such a large logistical pipeline to remove illegal aliens out of this country.
So you talk about localities working with or sort of being a part of this process. Would federal funding be contingent upon receiving federal funding, be contingent upon this work with ICE, working with ICE?
So I expect with the Republican House and Senate, given the mandate the president came in with, that will begin to be tied to federal funding. So the answer to your question is yes. That did not occur in the first Trump administration. I do expect that to occur at scale in the second Trump administration, and it will be a major, major efficiency boost to this entire effort.
We during the campaign cycle talked a lot about securing the border, right? Do you? We know that the President Biden and the Biden administration deployed troops to the border in support roles to work with the Department of Homeland Security. Do you advocate the Trump administration sending armed, active duty U.S. troops to the southern border in a more of a law enforcement capacity, having policing powers?
So not having policing powers, but blocking positions along the border to turn people back at the border. Yes, absolutely. Perfectly constitutional and legal for the president to do that. And like President Biden, President Trump in his first term did send troops near the border to perform a support role, just as you described in the Biden administration. But that was clearly inadequate in both cases. And I believe that he is determined and has announced his intention to close that border in between the legal ports of entry. And so all immigration will take place at the legal ports of entry, as it always should have, as people enter this country.
To be clear, you foresee armed U.S. soldiers physically forcing people back across the southern border?
honestly, when the border is protected, I don't expect there to be any forcing of people back because they won't come in the first place. That is the ultimate point of deterrent programs like this, like the Remain in Mexico program served that purpose in the first Trump term. But, we're not talking about tanks and planes here. We're talking about human beings holding their hands up and saying you can't come in, and then enforcing that and not letting people just walk by them.
Okay.
So if invaders want to try to force the military to hold the line, I expect them to hold the line and perform a physical barrier function.
All right, Ken Cuccinelli, we appreciate your time today. Thank you, sir.
Good to be with you.
And up next, Russia and Ukraine exchanged fire as Russia denies reporting in the Washington Post that President-elect Trump told Vladimir Putin not to escalate in Ukraine. You're watching Meet the Press now. And welcome back. Leaders around the world right now reckoning with what a second Trump administration means for the global landscape. This weekend, Russia and Ukraine launched some of their largest drone attacks against each other, a signal that the war may be escalating as President-elect Trump prepares to take office. Russia said yesterday it intercepted and destroyed 70 Ukrainian drones, including 34 over the Moscow area. Meanwhile, President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia launched a record 145 Iranian-made drones into Ukrainian territory. Now, this comes as Ukraine's top commander warns that Moscow has amassed tens of thousands of soldiers preparing to retake land in the Kursk region, and after President Zelensky and the White House confirmed North Korean troops are training in Russia to join the fight against Ukraine. It also comes as the Kremlin is denying a report in the Washington Post that Trump and Vladimir Putin spoke on the phone in recent days, calling that reporting, quote, completely untrue. Joining me now is former U.S. ambassador to Russia and an NBC News international affairs analyst, Michael McFaul. Ambassador, thank you for your time today. The war in Ukraine is going to be among the first foreign policy challenges for the new president-elect. As we enter this transition period now, what is your mind? How might the fighting in Ukraine shift at this point? Will both of these countries become increasingly aggressive like we saw over the weekend?
Well, remember, candidate Trump pledged that he was going to end this war in 24 hours. He even said he would do it before inauguration. So there's lots of debate, speculation about what he plans to do, what will be his proposals for a peace treaty or an end of hostilities. And so both sides believe that they need to maximize their position on the ground before conversations about some kind of negotiated settlement occurs. So you're seeing those effects. You're seeing both sides escalate through the air. And just as you reported, and most certainly my colleagues in Ukraine have been telling me over the last 24 hours, they expect a major escalation in the Russian region of Kursk that will, for the first time, and maybe it already has happened, will include North Korean soldiers involved in that fight.
We also know that support for Ukraine among Republicans in this country has been fading. Is there really such a thing as sort of Trump-proofing U.S. support for Ukraine? I know the National Security Advisor said over the weekend that the administration plans to push out all the help that has been allocated for Ukraine before this Biden administration ends. Is there anything that President Biden can do in his final days that President-elect Trump can't easily undo?
Well, first, I just want to remind everybody that the last vote about aid to Ukraine, overwhelming majority of senators supported it. So if Mr. Trump is going to say we're not going to do that, he's going to be going against the grain of 85, 90 senators. And it was also overwhelming majority in the House. So this will be a debate. This will just not be a fait accompli. The president has a lot to say over U.S. foreign policy, but so does the U.S. Congress. But second, to your point, yes, the Biden administration is trying to get out the remaining pieces of that aid to Ukraine before January 20th. That's the right thing to do. European leaders are meeting to talk about what they might do, including even there's speculation about there might be a new alliance with Ukraine, with some Baltic states and Poland. And third, there's new talk about finally releasing the $300 billion in Russian foreign currency reserves that we froze rightly 2 years ago. There's discussion, and I think it's the right discussion. Give that money to Ukraine now before January 20th.
You did reference that North Korean troops are preparing to join combat operations with the Russians. What does North Korea get out of sending their soldiers to fight this war alongside the Russians?
Well, we don't know for sure, but I can guarantee you Kim Jong-un is not sending these soldiers to Russia. This is a major, major decision he's making for nothing. I suspect he thinks that he will get advanced technologies to enhance his weapon systems, primarily his rocket systems, on which he can put nuclear weapons. And I think that is a very dangerous development. And I hope President Trump, because he has a relationship with Putin and he has a relationship with Kim Jong-un, will do all in his power to stop that technology transfer. That is deeply destabilizing, especially for our allies in South Korea, but I would say for all of Asia.
Yeah, and we do have this reporting today from the Washington Post that Trump and Putin spoke by phone. NBC News has not been able to confirm that reporting, and the Trump campaign isn't commenting on any conversations that Trump has had with other world leaders, whether they happened or not. The Kremlin is calling this reporting false information, Ambassador. What do you think is going on here, knowing that Trump isn't always using sort of the normal diplomatic channels of communication?
This is kooky. I can't think of a better word. Like, we should be able to know whether the president of Russia and the president-elect of the United States of America talked or not. That should be a verifiable fact. That should not be this mystery that we are in right now. And Mr. Peskov, somebody I used to work with when I was ambassador, he's not constrained by the truth. Let's be clear about that. But I read his statement over and over. He seems pretty unequivocal. But I also know those Washington Post reporters. Those are very good reporters. And so this is strange to me. I wonder, is somebody leaking something they overheard and was wrong? But we can do better than this. President-elect Trump should talk to world leaders. That's normal during transitions. But then he should put out statements about who he talked to. That's also normal. The American people have a right to know who he's speaking to, and the Biden administration has a right to know who he's speaking to because they are still in charge of American national security, at least until January 20th.
All right, Ambassador McFaul, thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Well, it's not just the war in Ukraine that will be top of mind for President-elect Trump and his foreign policy agenda when he returns to the White House. Even as the presidential transition process is underway, the U.S. is continuing to look for a diplomatic solution to end the conflict in the Middle East. Next hour, Secretary Anthony Blinken will host Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's top advisor, Ron Dermer, at the State Department. And late last week, on his last day in office, Israel's now ousted defense minister met with hostage families, telling them there is no military reason for Israel to remain in Gaza and that he could not explain Netanyahu's refusal to reach a ceasefire deal. In another sign of a potential deteriorating diplomatic path forward, officials in Qatar announcing over the weekend they are ending the mediation effort between Israel and Hamas and warned Hamas's political bureau that it was no longer welcome in the country. Joining me now from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, NBC News chief international correspondent Keir Simmons. So, Keir, Arab leaders are meeting there in Riyadh now. What are they saying about where this war effort stands? Do they see a diplomatic path here still?
Well, actually, what they're saying is pretty tough and has got tougher over the past year. They put out a list tonight of demands, if you like, including condemnation of Israel, support for the International Criminal Court's actions against Israel, even calling for reparations and relating to both Gaza and Lebanon. Whatever you think of that, and clearly there will be critics who will say, despite the fact that this is 80 countries, Arab and Islamic countries, that it's wrong. What it does indicate is that those countries have been pushed closer together by what has happened in the past year. And one illustration of that is the fact that the Iranian vice president has been here. And just listen to what the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia said at the beginning of this summit today. He said, "We call on the international community to compel Israel to respect the sovereignty of our sister country, Iran. Iran, that was in recent decades an adversary of Saudi Arabia. Now you've got the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia saying something like that. I think it illustrates the different world that President-elect Trump will inherit, completely different from 2016 and much more complex. And that means more challenges. He says he wants peace here in the Middle East and also, of course, with Ukraine and Russia, as you were talking about earlier. But the hurdles in the way of achieving that are different now than they were even 12 months ago.
All right, Keir Simmons for us in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia today. Keir, thank you. And as we note the ongoing conflict overseas, we want to recognize Veterans Day here in the United States. This is a day we honor those who serve in our nation's military and remember their sacrifices, as well as their service and the sacrifices of their families. In cities and towns across this nation, people lined the streets to celebrate their local veterans, past and present. Earlier today, President Biden participated in the wreath-laying ceremony at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier and delivered remarks from Arlington National Cemetery for his final time as president.
Today, as we strive on to finish the work of our moment, to bind the nation's wounds once again, we recommit to this sacred vow. This is the last time I will stand here at Arlington as Commander-in-Chief. It's been the greatest honor of my life.
And welcome back. We know that Republicans will take control of the Senate in the new Congress this January, but we don't yet know who will lead the majority. Republican Senators John Cornyn, Rick Scott, and John Thune are openly running for the top spot in the conference ahead of the leadership vote on Wednesday. And as he's done in the past, President-elect Donald Trump is making his thoughts known. In a social media post this weekend, he said that majority leader candidates should change the Senate status quo to allow him to make recess appointments for administration slots, potentially allowing him to sidestep the confirmation process. Now, Scott quickly responded that he will do whatever it takes to get Trump's picks confirmed, while Cornyn and Thune also said they would quickly approve Trump's nominees. Now, Wednesday's vote in the Senate Republican Conference will be secret, though some of Trump's top allies in the chamber have already voiced their support for Scott. Joining me now with the latest from Capitol Hill is NBC News, my colleague there, Ryan Nobles. So, Ryan, Trump said, make these things happen, and some of these contenders are trying to make these things happen. What's the state of play right now in this race for Senate Majority Leader? What did they agree to by sounding amenable to this recess appointment ask?
Well, more than anything, Aaron, what they're demonstrating is that they're going to do whatever Donald Trump asks them to do, that they read the results of this election just like the rest of us and understand pretty implicitly that Donald Trump is the leader of the Republican Party. So however he wants to conduct business, if they want to be the Senate Majority Leader, they need to get on board. Now, whether or not this idea of recess appointments actually becomes a reality remains to be seen. It wouldn't make it easier necessarily for Donald Trump to get his picks in place. Maybe they could do it a bit quicker than they normally would. But at the end of the day, they're going to have 53 votes when all the dust is settled. That should be more than enough to get most of Donald Trump's cabinet appointments confirmed and done so in pretty short order. So this is really about more of a loyalty test to Donald Trump. Are you willing to do the things I ask you to do? And so far, all three of these candidates seem pretty willing to do just that.
And so I'm curious sort of about the bigger picture, the bigger ramifications of that, Ryan. One of the big differences between the first Trump administration, the second Trump administration, is that there is this leadership that would be more dedicated, more loyal to Donald Trump once he's in the White House. What's the impact that could have in the Senate?
Well, it could be minor. It could be dramatic. It really depends on just how much Donald Trump intends to assert his will. You know, the Senate for a very long time has been a very deliberative body. They consider themselves to be the most deliberative body in the world. And part of that is because for most things that the Senate does, it requires this 60-vote threshold, which means you need bipartisan support on a wide range of issues in order to get it over the finish line. Donald Trump may force Senate Republicans to blow that filibuster up if there's something that he cares a lot about. For instance, his mass deportation program. There's no universe in which that gets 60 votes in the United States Senate. But does Trump lean on whoever the next Senate Majority Leader is to put it to the floor to blow up the filibuster specifically for something along those lines? So we don't yet know exactly how much Donald Trump is going to be willing to assert his will. But we know for sure that this Senate Republican conference that he's going to be dealing dealing with is much different than the Senate Republican conference that he dealt with in 2016. Yes, there will be senators that challenge him. Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. But there are fewer than them than there were last time around, and there's a whole new group of senators who believe in many ways that they credit the fact that they're in the Senate to the MAGA wing of the party, and they're going to be willing to do whatever Donald Trump wants.
So, Ryan, very quickly, let's move to the other side of the Capitol. What's the latest on the fight for control of the House? Are we still days away from knowing who the next speaker might be?
Yeah, probably just because it's going to take forever for California to finish counting their votes, and that's the lion's share of the races that we're still watching. There are 17 races that NBC has yet to project, but right now Republicans are in the driver's seat. Democrats would have to win 13 of these 17 remaining states in order to have any shot at a House majority. That's probably unrealistic. But what we do know, Aaron, under any circumstance, is that whomever emerges with the majority is going to do so under extremely tight margins. It could be only 5 or 6 seats that the ruling party has in their favor, which will make governing difficult. But that's something we've been accustomed to here for the last 2 years.
Indeed. Ryan Noble for us on the Hill. Ryan, thank you. And still to come, Trump's transformation of both political parties as Republicans and Democrats chart their path forward in 2025 and beyond. The panel is next. You're watching Meet the Press now. And welcome back. As we mentioned, President-elect Trump's presidential transition is ramping up, and on Wednesday, he will return to the White House for a meeting hosted by President Biden in the Oval Office. It is a White House tradition, though not a requirement, that notably Trump did not extend to Biden after the 2020 election. Joining me now is the panel, Jasmine Wright, reporter at Notice, Naveen Nayak, president and executive director of the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and Mark Short, former chief of staff to Vice President Mike Pence, and a Meet the Press political analyst. Thank you all for being here. Jasmine, I'll start with you. What do you make of some of the names that we're hearing, the early names we're hearing about who will be in the next Trump administration? Does it tell you anything about the direction of the incoming administration?
Well, I think it certainly tells you a lot about the relationships that Trump has with some of these people who have either been floated or that he's confirmed via his social media or other reporters have confirmed. Particularly the fact that he is focused on loyalty, that he is trying to avoid what I believe he thinks happened in 2016, where he put people in these positions and maybe places that he didn't know so well because he was new to D.C., but that pushed back on him and kind of gave him some guardrails while in office. He doesn't want that anymore. And so I think that he is choosing people, and we will continue to see him choose people that are loyal to him and that won't push back when he wants to do things that may fit outside of what is known to be done in D.C.
Speaking about loyalists, Naveen, I want to play something from Tom Homan, who's going to be the border czar in the new Trump administration. This was him on Fox News earlier today.
I've seen some of these Democratic governors say they're going to stand in the way. They're going to make it hard for us. Well, a suggestion: if you're not going to help us, get the hell out of the way, but we're going to do it. So if we can't get assistance from New York City, and we may have to double the number of agents we send to New York City because we're going to do the job. We're going to do the job without you or with you.
And we've heard governors, we've heard Kathy Hochul and Gavin Newsom and the governor of Illinois talk about being ready to fight the Trump administration. Do Democrats have a plan on how to deal with things like a mass deportation effort around the country?
Yeah, I think they're actually more aware and ready of the fact that, especially now that Republicans are going to have a trifecta in Washington, that the real leverage and power resides in the states with not only governors, but attorneys generals, mayors when it comes to issues like immigration. There's no doubt in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, the biggest kind of thorn in their side were not Republicans in Congress, who were really in disarray, but it was Ron DeSantis, Greg Abbott, and I think you are going to see a lot of these governors who represent a big future of the party refusing to cooperate when they feel like there's a real violation of civil rights, of human rights, and making sure that they do thwart the administration if they violate those values.
We know that Homan was a contributor to Project 2025 as well.
Shocking.
The president-elect has said he was not involved, had nothing to do with it, didn't want anything to do with Project 2025. But does a pick like this telegraph anything to you in terms of the influence Project 2025 might have in the incoming administration?
I mean, the best tell was Trump distancing himself, right? I mean, he's out there praising the Heritage Foundation and the efforts around Project 2025. There's no question. Everyone should be preparing for Project 2025 to be the playbook. Do they run every play in it? Who knows? We'll have to watch. But I think there's no question that it is going to be very extreme, very cruel, and it's going to cause a lot of damage to a lot of Americans.
Mark, I'm curious about your thoughts about Stephen Miller, for example, we know is going to be Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. People heard Susie Wiles and thought, oh, good, this is going to be a tighter ship for the incoming administration. And then you hear names like Tom Homan and Stephen Miller. What's your reaction to that?
I actually think the transition has gotten off to a great start. I think that Tom Homan is not selected because of his association with Project 2025. He's a career ICE agent. I think he's the perfect pick for this. And whether Democrats like it or not, the reality is that border security was a top issue for the American people in this election and has been because of the Biden-Harris failures on that issue. And so I think he's the perfect pick. And Stephen, I get, can be polarizing in the media, but Stephen has been with Donald Trump since 2015. He was the very first person he and Hope Hicks on that campaign. There's nobody who has stuck with Donald Trump longer and has been, more loyal to the president than Stephen. And so I think that I think those are natural picks. And I think I'm encouraged by Lee Zeldin, Elise Stefanik as well. I think it's so far it's been off to a great start for their team.
We haven't heard many other names about some of the positions that are closer to the president, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, those sorts of things. But we did hear over the weekend that the president-elect said he wants to be able to make recess appointments in a Senate that is a Republican Senate anyway. Does that signal to you that there might be some controversial figures that come up for positions in the next administration?
Oh, I think so for sure. But I also think that, frankly, the Senate has overplayed its hands in confirmations from both Republicans and Democrats. It is something that years ago when the system was set up for the advise and consent, there was a handful of picks. Now they have thousands. And there's no way the Senate goes to that. And Republicans have held up Democrat nominees. Democrats have held up Republican nominees unnecessarily. And so I think this is part of the pushback on the way the system has, I think, gotten off track over the years.
I think recess appointments will be one of the least controversial things Donald Trump does in the time ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Jasmine, you had a piece over the weekend. I want to ask you about this. There was some interesting insight into the Harris campaign. One Democratic official told you, quote, "I'm amazed that we even got close. The campaign has been broken since the beginning." So what are you hearing about the blame game that's going on within the Democratic Party now?
Yeah, well, the blame game is fierce when it comes to Democrats trying to process what happened on Tuesday. I know from speaking to a lot of sources in and around the Harris campaign that they believe that she inherited really a faulty campaign infrastructure created under Biden for a couple reasons, because a lot of people didn't want to join when Biden was on the ticket. A lot of people didn't want to move to Wilmington. And therefore, it was a campaign that was unable to scale up when Harris replaced Biden. They had a lot of reservations that were already scheduled under Biden, a lot of consulting contracts that were already under Biden that they still chose to fulfill, which left them kind of financially in a bad place, as well as the culture was an issue, their ability to retain subscribers, which of course they used to not just get more money from, but also a volunteer bank. So there are a lot of little things that by far, of course, people are not attributing this as the only reason why the vice president lost, right? The messaging they feel was an issue, the scope of the campaign, the strategicness of the campaign, some of the folks that she brought on were an issue. But there are these little things that they say also contributed, kind of a death by 1,000 cuts. And I really, there's so much in this piece. I want people to go read it because it is incredibly detailed step by step of the way that people both inside and outside the campaign say that it kind of failed her.
The how of it all, Naveen, I want to play something that Bernie Sanders said on Meet the Press yesterday. Watch this.
Bottom line, if you're an average working person out there, do you really think that the Democratic Party is going to the mats, taking on powerful special interests and fighting for you? I think the overwhelming answer is no, and that is what has got to change.
So do you agree? Is that what went wrong for Democrats?
Listen, I think there's an easy explanation to this, and there's a much longer one, and I hope the party takes the longer one. The easy one is, listen, every election for this entire century, except for two, have been change elections. And this was, serious headwinds that are global with inflation and clearly the immigration problem, which was, not a global issue. But I do think but that's the easy explanation. I think Democrats are slipping with a lot of working class voters, and it's not a policy problem. I think that I worry that some of the prescriptions are too simple because you had a lot of policies that Democrats champion in ballot initiatives, minimum wage, labor rights, that passed overwhelmingly in really tough states where Democrats were losing. And so this is a much bigger brand problem that the party has that it really has to grapple with and why it's not reaching working class voters.
All right. That is where we will leave it for today. Mark, Naveen, and Jasmine, thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. And we are back with more Meet the Press Now tomorrow, of course. The news continues now with Hallie Jackson Now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.